Good morning. It is a moment of pride as I stand before you here today to welcome, on behalf of the Student Affairs Council of IIM Ahmedabad, Honorable Member of Parliament, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor's remarkable contribution to the country, be that as a distinguished former diplomat, as a UN envoy for 29 years, former Minister of External Affairs, a politician par excellence, a meticulous parliamentarian, or a prolific writer, has been inspiring. He exudes an elegant charm, wit, and grace. Adding a personal anecdote, based on my stint as a legislative analyst, I chose meticulous as an adjective to share that the Member of Parliament is very sincere. I'll take you back to the story when, while we worked there, he was one of the only parliamentarians who actually did his own research, drafted his points, and presented his analysis at the table of the Parliament. His skills as a powerful orator need no emphasis, especially after his address at Oxford Union in 2015, or as being amongst the most followed politician on Twitter. Every time Dr. Tharoor rises to the floor, his engaging and insightful perspective, coupled with an impeccable sense of calm and a wonderful sense of humor, adds values to debates of national importance. In his recently published books, Paradoxical Prime Minister, Dr. Tharoor has raised a very pertinent question about the state of affairs in the governance of the Indian economy and society, ranging from issues of rising protectionism, systematic oppression, culture of silence, state of control of statutory independent bodies, divide in terms of communal violence, lynchings, and riots. To further our discussion, on behalf of the Alumni and External Relations Committee, Ashish Bharatwal would be moderating the panel discussion basis questions received from the faculty and students at IIM Ahmedabad. This will be followed by an audience round. As we welcome you on stage, sir, I would like to express our gratitude to you for making the effort to interact with our members of IIM Ahmedabad community. So we'd be honored if you could share a few words of address.
Oops, sorry about that. Good morning. The mics worked better when she was using them. Okay, there we are. I wasn't really planning a speech. It was billed as an interactive session, and I'm looking forward to the interaction. But since you've given me the mic to say a couple of words, let me say two things. One is, it's great to see you all, because I might have been among you. You know, when I was graduating from college in 1975, there were only two IIMs in the country, IIM Ahmedabad and IIM Calcutta. And my parents, who had already despaired of my choosing history over economics, said, at least try for the IIMs. And I managed to come first on the merit list to both IIM Ahmedabad and IIM Calcutta. But I didn't come at the end, because I also got a scholarship to go off and study international politics and international affairs at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in the States, and that was the direction in which my life went afterwards. And I never quite ended up selling soap and detergent for a Hindustanized multinational, which might have been my only option at that time. Actually, you know, in many ways I say this with a certain envy of all of you, because you are studying at a time in which the options available are so much greater than they were for young people your age in my time. Because when we were coming out of college and looking at the future, those were the days when we were still a relatively closed, very statist, protected economy, and highly regulated and highly restricted. And therefore, the number of options, the number of possibilities, the number of career streams, even the number of subjects one could study were much, much more limited than what you are all enjoying today. You are actually living in a very different India since 1991, and all the more so after these 3 decades almost of dramatic change. And therefore, I think it's difficult for you to imagine, in many ways, what exactly would have been the kind of environment in which you were contemplating your options. Certainly, in my time, one could understand and value the public respect for the Sarkari Naukri, because the Sarkari Naukri was the best option available. And taking the UPSC examinations and aspiring in those days for the Indian Foreign Service, because you had to be in the top 10 of the UPSC exams to get into the Foreign Service. IAS was very much a second option. In those days, this was the sort of ultimate in human aspiration available. Those who couldn't clear those exams and become IFS or IAS officials ended up, of course, trying their luck in the private sector, settling merely for the making of money rather than from transforming the country. And finally, those who couldn't get either of those were the sort of poor unfortunates in society who had to make their way into professions like teaching. So I say this with my tongue in my cheek because I have a lot of respect for my teachers, and I've just had a very good conversation with your dean. So no disrespect intended, but I'm just saying it was a different India. And in many ways, just thinking of the options confronting me as I graduated and the possibilities open to all of you is in itself an illustration of how much India has changed in the little under 3.5 decades since I graduated from college. I'm very happy to move into the interactive session, and at least those who did come, I look forward to interacting with you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So we'll start off with questions collated from faculty members and students, and this will go on for approximately 50 minutes. And then we'll open the round for questions from the audience. So, good morning, sir. My first question is regarding the role of premier Indian higher education institutes. So, do you think the IITs and IIMs are contributing to the Indian economy as envisioned by Pandit Nehru? Brain drain and lack of interest in the economy building research are rampant. Could they have been foreseen by the policymakers back then? And what kind of incentive mechanisms can be put so that this Indian intelligentsia can be put to better use?
Good question. I certainly think the IIMs have been a success story. Obviously, you started off as the only management schools in the country, and therefore it took a while for competition to emerge. I think the first non-IIM in management that had any credibility was XLRI in Jamshedpur. Now, of course, there's been a proliferation of management institutes in the private sector. But the gold standard is still the IIMs and, of course, the ISB. And management education has established itself as an extremely valuable stream. Don't forget, the entire field is rather new. I think the first management degree was offered around the 1920s, I think, in Chicago. And there wasn't, before that, any such thing as studying management. So where you've come today in the IIMs is certainly a remarkable entrenching of position, of quality, of standards, and indeed of the kind of value that this provides. But when you say later in the question, what about the research system, there we have a challenge, because what has happened in our country is that we have not quite evolved our universities in the ways in which the Western universities have. We have created a sort of artificial wall between universities where a lot of teaching is done but practically no research, and institutes where research is done and practically no teaching. And the result of this separation between the two of these important disciplines is that we have ended up in a place in which, most unfortunately, we are scoring very, very low in global rankings, because global rankings expect you both to teach and to do systematic research, and then to have serious levels of citations for the research done by your faculty and your students. And that, of course, is where we don't score, because you go to a place like, say, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, they get great points for research, practically no teaching, practically no students, and the vice versa in some of the good institutes, the IITs in particular, where there's an awful lot of teaching and practically no research. Now, this is gradually changing. We all woke up to this really only about a few years ago. When I was at MHRD, we got the Times Higher Education Supplement, one of the world's leading rankings agencies, to come and do a presentation on what went into the rankings. It was startling to discover 30% was for research, a further 30% for citations, and then 15% for internationalization of students and faculty. So Indian colleges were really Indian universities are out of the race because we were getting 0 out of the first 75 marks and then trying to compete on the last 25 alone, which obviously didn't give us a chance. And there's now realization that you can't have the separation wall, there must be much more commonality. Talking to the dean just before this event, he was telling me about the efforts being made to create a collaborative ecosystem amongst research institutions here in Ahmedabad, and I think that's an excellent way forward. I do believe there's a lot more that can be done, not only in government-funded institutions, because unfortunately the era in which we could look to the government to finance everything is over. The government doesn't have the spare cash, and what is more, if you look at the OECD countries and just look at R&D, for example, in the OECD countries, the developed countries, 75% of R&D is paid for from the private sector. A further 15% from universities and 10% or less from the government, government-funded institutions in the Western world. Now in India, the proportions are almost the opposite. It's like 85% is funded by the government. The universities have very little funding of their own other than government funding, and the private sector does astonishingly little. Now that must change. There must be much more of that being done and much more in collaboration with each other, particularly things like academia-industry interface. Now that again raises a different question, because the academia does not only exist to serve industry. Industry will have a very functional interpretation of research, do things that we can manufacture and market and sell, or solve a specific functional problem, whereas pure research often stumbles across things by accident that they weren't looking for. That kind of research is less easy to finance in our present environment, but that also needs to change. It seems to me that since God gave us 17% of the world's brains, since we have 17% of the world's population, it's somewhat disgraceful that we only produce 2.8% of the world's research output. That must definitely change.
Thank you, sir. Moving on, I have a question, a slightly longish question about the fall of liberal democracy. So in his 1989 essay, Francis Fukuyama said that the final frontier of all forms of government will be Western liberal democracy. But in today's era, we see the rise of
liberal
Trump.
Capitalism, quite specifically.
Yeah. So in today's era, we have seen the rise of Trump, Brexit, Bolsonaro's election, and these suggest that the intellectual political class has lost its traction among the masses. They blame the 2008 financial crisis on this very class, which is now bearing the brunt of various botched up efforts, which may or may not be attributed to them. So is this some temporary change, or is this nature of political mobilization exhibiting elements of commonness?
No, there are elements of commonness, but it's still, I think, a process that's a phase. I mean, ultimately in our country and in the world as a whole, phases come and go. Nothing is ever permanent. And if you just look back on the 20th century, you'll see, for example, in the 20s and 30s, the seemingly irresistible rise of fascism. And where is that today? You will find different kinds of phases in the world. My perception of this is it's in many ways a backlash to globalization. Because globalization was not merely an economic phenomenon, it was that. You saw the melting away of borders, the easy transfer of money and resources, multinational operations across borders, all of that stuff. But along with it was a sort of cultural globalization. The emergence of Davos man meant the celebration of a new kind of global cosmopolitanism, where people seem to be functioning on a sort of international plane, jet setting from conference room to five-star hotel, meeting in airport lounges, creating a sort of new global upper class, as it were, that was seemingly driving the world engine. And it's not surprising that the backlash to the one involved a backlash to the other. That is a backlash to economics, where the so-called losers in the battle for globalization, the ones who felt, the blue-collar workers in the developed world, for example, who felt that their jobs were the ones being exported to Shanghai, they were inevitably going to be resentful. But along with that came a resentment and a rejection of the global cosmopolitanism, which, remember, also translated in many developed countries into foreigners arriving more easily in their midst. So you have, whether it's H-1B workers from India coming to America in thousands, tens of thousands, whether it was Polish and Slovak sort of maids and nannies and carpenters and plumbers landing up in England, which certainly influenced the Brexit vote, whether it was North African Muslims showing up in Western Europe, whether it was the increasing flood of refugees from strife-torn Arab world. All of these things meant there was a visible sign of foreignness coming. And coupled with this rejection of global cosmopolitanism, a number of people have started asserting their own identities in a very negative way, in a very xenophobic way, while claiming that they are more rooted in authenticity in their own nations and in their own national cultures. So whether it's the Trumpists in the Republican Party in America who are sort of thriving on guns, God, and gays, or guns, God, and anti-gays, whether it's Marine Le Pen in France with her passionately anti-immigrant campaign, Trump, of course, also anti-immigrant, whether it is Mr. Erdogan in Turkey trying to reassert an Islamism that since the revolution of Ataturk has been pushed away in the name of secularism, or whether it's Mr. Modi in India trying to do the same thing and more narrowly redefine Indian identity from the rather capacious and inclusive identity that Nehru promoted after 1947, whether all of these phenomena are linked by these common elements. But as I say, I don't think they're going to last forever. It's a phase. I think eventually all phases play themselves out. And while democracy may have become more illiberal, as long as it's still democracy, democracy contains its own self-correcting mechanisms. And that means that voters will eventually wake up to what they have created as a result of certain choices, and they'll come back to others.
So the next question is slightly populist. So this question has had recurring themes in our forms that we floated. So the question is, in a way, is why do you reinforce your image as a super intellectual through the use of rarely used and archaic words? And I realized personally that some words fit certainly better than others. So Schadenfreude cannot be replaced by sadism, etc. But then does this not detach you or put you further away from people who are looking for something baser in their politics, in their politicians?
No, look, it started off with my being perhaps not sufficiently conscious of using words that I learned, remember, in India. I mean, my milieu, as it were, a farrago of confused thoughts was a favorite phrase in my St. Stephen's College debating days. It's not that I was saying something that I thought Indians didn't know, but when I issued it and realized that in fact it was quite unknown, I was a bit taken aback. But then after a while it became a joke that one could play along with. So for example, the time that Nitish Kumar defected suddenly and abruptly from the Congress side to the BJP side, I said, word of the day, snollygoster, first used 1845, translation, a shrewd, unprincipled politician, latest used today. And I didn't have to use his name or say anything about Bihar, and people knew what I was getting at. So in that sort of purpose, it's fun. I mean, obviously the last one, Floxinosi nihilipidification, was, as it turned out, a fairly shrewd marketing gimmick. I was going to announce the imminent publication of my new book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister. Just announcing that a book was coming out might not get much attention. So I said, why don't I say something that is bound to get attention for itself, and in the process draw attention to it. And I didn't even take a marketing course at IIM Ahmedabad.
But do you realize people may actually have hippopotamonstrous squipedaliophobia?
I'm very impressed. Yes, they probably would. And in fact, the fact is that I'm conscious of that. And you'll notice that 99.9% of what I write, whether it's tweets, whether it's articles, and I publish at least 2 articles a week, sometimes 3, I use words that most people can understand without any difficulty, without consulting a dictionary. And I always use very precise words. It's only now, once in a while, as I say, in a slightly jokey vein, that I will use a word you can't lift very easily. But most of the time, the purpose of communication is to be understood. So it doesn't actually help you to say things that no one will understand. On the other hand, since there's a lot of malicious and willful and deliberate misunderstanding, like you can quote somebody saying something and have that quote be attributed to you so that they can attack you, then you realize that not all misunderstandings are innocent, especially in our present political climate.
Thank you, sir. So following up, so this discussion we have had a lot of times in our Indian Economy and Society Today lectures. So is the current political environment in India, again, this might be resounding of the first question that I asked, is it attributable to Indian National Congress's less than perfect rule in the last 60 years? So I'll explain. So should you be blamed for the debilities in the constitution and the incentive making? For example, the police and the investigative agencies are not autonomous and are answerable to their political overlords. The British formed the Indian police on the lines of not the British police but the Irish constabulary, which was under the bureaucrats. There was an error in the 74th Amendment Act which renders municipalities practically impotent because the elected representatives cannot really bring about changes. There have been allegations of pseudo-secularism and there has been a spate of scams. It almost seems like the country's polity was handed to the NDA on a platter. And Hindus have been feeling ignored, and a general undercurrent of Islamophobia and in the world anti-Semitism over the world has been spreading. So again, was this handed over to NDA on a platter?
It's a very important question that I will take completely seriously. First, on the first half of your question about the way in which institutions were handled and so on, many of you may know from my earlier writings that I was a critic of the Congress myself, and in particular the deinstitutionalization that began under the emergency. Because to my mind, democracy is not an event, it's a process. It's a process that keeps going on in perpetuity. And what Nehruji began, the process of entrenching institutions, was in fact a signal Congress contribution, because it would have been very easy in 1947, and particularly after the death of Gandhiji in 48 and the death of Patel in 50, Sardar Patel, it would have been very easy for Nehru to twist the entire system around to suit his purposes, because he was unchallengeable. And as you were seeing in many developing countries soon after independence, the nationalist heroes turned themselves into dictators, saying that you needed to curb dissent and so on in order to grow and develop the country. And there would have been a fair amount of sympathy for that argument, because these countries are emerging usually from centuries of colonial exploitation and loot, and there was a need for them to build from scratch. Nehru was almost unique in his belief that you could actually do this rebuilding within a democracy. And he would go out of his way to entrench respect for institutions above that for individuals. There was the ostentatious deferral to the president and the prime minister, president and the vice president, who outranked the prime minister in protocol terms, right up to the way in which he would yield to them on protocol occasions and so on. There was the instilling of respect for the judiciary. I remember one occasion, he was a fairly hot-tempered man. He said something intemperate at a press conference about a judge. Immediately, before the end of the day, he was feeling so embarrassed that he wrote an abject letter of apology to the judge, and an even more craven letter to the Chief Justice of India, apologizing for having insulted the judiciary. And those letters were released and made public, so that people could understand that Nehru may be the most powerful man in India, but he is completely subordinate to the rule of law as everybody else is, and it was his duty to respect the judiciary. Now, that kind of culture was what Nehruji tried to install for 17 years, that continued for some time, but the emergency was a setback. Fortunately, it turned out to be an aberration, and after a couple of years, we once again came back to the kind of democratic system that we all cherish and respect, in which institutions had their place. Today, unfortunately, we have once again got to a point where institutions that had been proud of their independence and freedom, including in particular, since I began by mentioning the universities, let me add to that the fourth estate, the media, are now behaving in ways that almost seem to indicate you don't need to declare an emergency, because if you can sufficiently either cajole or cudgel the potential critics and independent voices, then you don't need to declare an emergency. So you don't need to censor the press if you can just make a phone call to a powerful owner of that press, asking him to curb an editor or fire an editor. And that has been happening. We've seen editors and journalists fired in recent years. With the case of the CBI, we've seen this most extraordinary development of the number one accusing the number two, and the number two accusing the number one, and the number one arresting the number two, and both being moved aside, and all of this stuff going on. You've seen the Supreme Court, the unprecedented development of 4 judges coming before the press and saying democracy is in danger. You have seen one issue after another in which institutions, and I must say the Election Commission, since elections are a few months away, is also one about which very serious question marks have been raised. Because at the time of the elections in Gujarat and Uttarakhand, for the first time, instead of the two being announced at the same time, the Gujarat election announcement was deferred for 12 days to give the government time to announce a few freebies before the election dates were announced. And this kind of thing seriously raises questions about the independence of supposedly independent institutions. And that, to my mind, is a very deep, deep, deep danger for democracy. Nobody is immortal. The individuals who are running the system today will move away, but the institutions that they leave behind will be the guiding lights for your generation to take over. And if the institutions have become hollow shells whose purposes have been deformed and twisted, then we'd have a problem. On the second half of your question about the failures of the Congress, I myself would be amongst the first to admit there were serious lapses and failures, but I would also argue that there were very, very serious misrepresentations as well, which took ground in the last few years. The so-called telecom scam is a good example. When you had a CAG report, there's another independent institution that's no longer independent, but the CAG wrote a report against his own government saying 1,76,000 crore putative loss, but that was computed on a notional value of spectrum had it been sold at the maximum possible price, and has now been sufficiently established that maximum possible price was A, not possible because no one could afford to pay it, and B, there was a conscious policy decision on the part of the UPA government that cheap telephone rates for Indian consumers were more important than maximizing revenue for the government out of the sale of spectrum. But that sensible argument was not available in the din of all these lurid accusations on the front page of the papers. The Anna Hazare movement would have hurt whichever government was in power at that time. It happened to be ours. It captured the imagination of the middle classes, the TV-watching public, and so on. And the result was that that also got hung on the neck of the Congress. There was also 10 years of anti-incumbency, which will hurt any party, anywhere. And then finally, there was the extraordinary, unfortunate situation from the Congress point of view of the fuel price rise, because Indians are very price-sensitive voters, and UPA came to power with oil at $40 a barrel and the dollar at 40 rupees. By the end of its 10 years, oil was $140 a barrel, and the dollar was at almost 60 rupees. And the result was that each dollar of the international price going up cost the Indian voter much, much more at the pump. And they resented it. There was a perception that the Congress hadn't done enough to shield the consumer. Now, actually, Congress kept the buffer of administered prices for as long as possible till it was literally costing the government lakhs of crores a day. And they said this cannot be sustained indefinitely and break the bank. And so they finally lifted price controls, and the result was that the consumer bore the brunt. Now, we've seen, of course, that Mr. Modi had extraordinary good luck because he came to power, and within weeks, the oil price had crashed internationally from $140 to as low as 35 at one occasion. And I think the first year, the average price of the pump was $37. The second year was about $60, and the third year was about, the second year was about $40, the third year was about $65. So the oil price gradually started climbing again, but it had dropped so much from UPA levels that the benefits could easily have been passed on to the consumer. But the government chose instead to gouge the consumer through taxes, so that the tax on a litre of petrol, which UPA had pegged at $3.92 per litre, is now $19.48. And that's why you're not seeing much of any savings at the pump, because whatever you could have saved by reduced prices, you are spending and paying taxes to the government. That's essentially what's happened. All of these things are not fully portrayed accurately in the media. Some of us are trying to say so, and those who follow us on social media may be discovering the facts. But for the general public, and especially those reliant on mainstream media, there is no such awareness. Mainstream media tends to focus on the sensationalistic, the voyeuristic, the breaking news. And once they've broken somebody with their news, they'll go on and break somebody else. There's no real sense of social responsibility in the mainstream media. It's all about TRPs. And the result is that these real issues that affect the the wallets of the average Indian voter are not known. But at that time, they were known and they were hung on the necks of the Congress. So I think in 2014, Congress lost to a perfect storm. Now, your final point of your rather long question was about the perception that Hindus have about the Muslims. This is one of the more bewildering myths that the BJP has most effectively propagated in this country. I mean, if the Muslims were such a pampered minority, why do they still happen to be the poorest, the most marginalized, and the worst represented community in our country, with underrepresentation in the police force and overrepresentation in the prison population? You have to ask yourself this question. Is this a privileged, pampered community or one that is struggling to recover from the trauma of partition? Remember what happened in partition was all our communities had more or less the same class structure. That is, all communities, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, etc., had an underclass, had a lower middle class, had a middle class, had an upper middle class, had rich people, zamindars, all of that. Every community had it. But in the case of the Muslims alone, that entire upper middle class and middle class, the educated people, upped sticks and went to Pakistan. They had a huge magnet drawing them there because of all the opportunities vacated for them by departing Hindus. So suddenly you had a Muslim community that was very peculiar in its demographic shape, with a small elite who were frankly too rich to leave, who had big lands and big mansions or big titles and big positions, and a large impoverished underclass. Now, if successive Congress governments, in creating so-called socialist economic policies that would benefit the poorest of the poor, felt obliged to pay attention to the lot of Muslims in India, it's because they were disproportionately amongst the poorest of the poor. That is essentially the socio-economic underpinning of this. It's not that suddenly the Congress party or the various other governments, and I include all the governments, including and up to Atal Bihari Vajpayee at that time, felt any particular sense of quote-unquote pro-Muslim feeling. They were doing what governments responsibly do, which is to feel a certain sense of extra responsibility for the weakest in their own populations. And that's essentially what governments have done. I am at a loss to understand where this perception of appeasement comes from. People point to things like the Hajj subsidy. The Hajj subsidy mainly benefited Air India. It didn't benefit the Muslim pilgrims. But anyway, even the Congress government had started phasing it out. I was briefly, for 1 year, I was Minister for Hajj Affairs. And I myself said, why are we subsidizing the airlines? It's now a free market. There are private airlines. Let's hold a tender and have people bid for these seats. The government was paying the subsidy never to the individual pilgrim, but de facto to the airlines. So there were some of these things that I just still don't understand. Okay, Muslim personal law is often held up as an example. But who does Muslim personal law affect? It affects Muslims who choose to live under it. Personal law covers marriage, inheritance, death and divorce. That's basically personal law. If tomorrow you enter into a civil contract with a Muslim businessman, no personal law is going to help him. It's a civil contract. Personal law is only in these situations. Why is it offensive to Hindus? How does it bother us? I'm at a loss to understand. I want somebody to parse for me. I've heard this as recently as last night at dinner in Ahmedabad. We must stop appeasing Muslims. Anyway, what is this Muslim appeasement in tangible terms? Let's look objectively at what exactly we believe the Indian state is doing that it should not be doing. Now, there may be specific issues of choices made in our country, some going back to the British days, which need to be fixed. As a Hindu, I have myself been puzzled about the fact that since the British times, Hindu temples are run by the state, and every other religious community runs its own places of worship. Why should a collection that I give to Tirupati or to Guruvayur or to Sri Padmanabha Swami have to end up in the state government coffers and they pay the salary to the priests? I don't understand that, and I'm perfectly prepared to have somebody question this practice. But the fact is that that's not what the debate is about. The debate is about somehow, quote-unquote, pampering or appeasing one section of our population. I see very little evidence of any such pampering or appeasing. That's where I'll leave it for now. I'm sure that some of you will have follow-up questions, and I'm very happy to pursue this, but that's the answer to the question as you asked it.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is about soft Hindutva. So when Congress lost the general elections in 2014, Mr. A.K. Antony suggested to the party that soft Hindutva should be the way going forward. And as we have seen recently, the changes in the rhetoric and the behavior of the Congress leadership, we have seen that soft Hindutva coming up into Congress's DNA slowly is basically a defeat, so to say, for secularism. What do you have to say about this?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that soft Hindutva has anything to do with the Congress party. As I've explained in my book, Why I'm a Hindu, Hinduism is a religion. Hindutva is a purely political doctrine, and the two have nothing to do with each other. Hindutva is a fundamentally anti-Hindu political doctrine because it undermines everything that is valuable and precious about the Hindu faith. Its openness, its acceptance of diversity, its faith in multiple forms of worship, multiple gods, a religion without a single holy book but multiple holy books, a religion without a single Sunday but multiple Sundays, a religion without a single pope but multiple sons and gurus. This is not a religion that is a monotheistic, rigid, doctrinaire Semitic faith. Hindutva imagines such an idea and seeks to propagate a notion of Hindu Rashtra that is fundamentally at odds with everything about Hinduism. And to my mind, Hinduism should be celebrated. I'm a proud Hindu. Hindutva should be resisted because it's a dangerous doctrine with its wellspring of roots very much in the 1920s fascist ideologies of those years, where even the man who invented the term Hindutva, Savarkar, wrote about Hindus as a race, in very much the ways in which the Nazis fantasized about the Aryan race, or the Italians talked about ethnic pride and race purity. All of those ideas from the 1920s, which have been discredited everywhere else in the world, are still alive and kicking only in one place, and that's in the Hindutva movement. So the Congress will have nothing to do with Hindutva. It will, however, have a political interest in neutralizing the rather insidious argument made by the acolytes of Hindutva that they are the only ones standing up for the Hindus because they are the only true Hindus in the race. Congress has recognized that if the debate becomes one between sort of true Hindus and godless secularists, then the godless secularists will always lose because the country is full of good Hindus who believe in their faith, and if they are persuaded that these are the only good Hindus, they're going to vote for them. So it's important for the Congress to say that this is a territory in which these guys have no business to fight, because we are genuine Hindus. We believe in an inclusive and accepting Hinduism, but at the same time, many of us are Hindus. We also have many good Christians and Sikhs and Muslims amongst us who are proud of being good Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims and Christians as well. But those of us who are Hindu, for us, we will no longer hide our Hinduism in the old-fashioned belief that religion is an intensely personal matter. It's between you and your maker, and it's nobody else's business. So the Congress party was never overt in its respect for religion, even though many Congress leaders throughout the years have been fairly religious-minded. But now they're saying, no, we need to signal to the voters that this is not BJP territory alone, that religious faith very much exists for us too. And let's neutralize that issue, and now let's talk about development. If the issue is no longer Hindu versus secularist, but there are two Hindus who have different interpretations of Hinduism, then that neutralizes the debate. Now we can talk about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. We can ask you, have your Achhe Din come yet? We can ask serious questions that actually affect the well-being of individual Indians. That's the whole argument.
Got it, sir. Sir, now we would want to talk about your time at the UN. Has the UN over the years become more able to fulfill its mandate? Do you think the antiquated laws like the veto power among the few countries and the composition of the Security Council, do they need to be changed to accommodate to the dynamic, changing world scenario today?
It's a very tough question to answer, simply because I've been away from the UN for the last 10 years. But now that I'm an outsider to the UN, I no longer slip, as I used to do when I first came to India, involuntarily into the habit of saying we when I meant the UN rather than the Indian government. Now that I'm really out of the system, the perception I get is the UN is much less relevant than it used to be. Certainly, I lived through the UN at a time when 5 of the top 6 stories in the BBC World News involved the UN, when no front page of any newspaper in the world was complete without a story or two involving a UN issue or an issue that the UN was handling. Today, you're hard-pressed to find any serious mention of the UN in anything. And the only occasion when the UN seems to get some attention is when the Security Council meets on some global crisis. But since most global crises appear to be handled unilaterally or bilaterally these days, even that is relatively rare. The recent change of special envoy for Syria gone largely unnoticed in the Indian press. So we're seeing a situation in which the UN seems, if anything, to be much, much less, what's the word I want, relevant than it should be. And I believe it should be because it's truly indispensable. It's the only universal body we've got that brings together the, every single country on the planet on a common platform to find agreed solutions to common problems. And to my mind, we need to preserve it because otherwise, if tomorrow countries moved away from the UN, we dissolved it, we would no longer have that buffer to protect us when it comes to needing to pursue common endeavors across the global stage. The UN still has an extraordinary capacity to set the global agenda. The whole consciousness of the environment goes back to the UN Stockholm Conference in '73 and thereafter UN conferences at Rio, at Tokyo and so on, Paris. We now have the consciousness of urban development and things thanks to the Habitat Conference in Nairobi. We've had the UN coming up with ideas on rights of the child, on the rights of the aging, on a number of global issues, human rights issues as well, which only a universal body could actually do. And that's why it seems to me very, very important that we continue trying to promote its use there, even if it's no longer going to be the premier body on international peace and security, because for some years it has ceased to be that.
So now I would like to pose a counterfactual. We all know very well that you have spoken stridently against colonialism and so on and so forth. But my question is, what would have been the key elements of the Indian milieu as it is today had we not been colonized? Had we won the battles of Plassey or Buxar or Panipat, would we still have developed the ideals of socialism and equality that arose in India as a result of the struggle against British?
Well, I think that, as you said, with the counterfactual, my guess is as good as yours. But I would argue that, in fact, you could extrapolate from the trends of that period that had we not been colonized by the Brits or by anybody else, because there were others trying at the same time. Don't forget the British beat the French and the Dutch and so on in order to establish their supremacy. But had we not been colonized by the Brits, it seems to me that what we could conceivably have become would be a country gradually, essentially taken over by the Marathas. They were the dominant force at that time. They reached as far as Calcutta till the British kept them out with the Maratha ditch. They got to Delhi and essentially the Mughal emperor was a prisoner of the Marathas. He was still emperor in name because it was useful to have him there, but he did what the Marathas told him to do, and firmans were issued that were dictated by the Marathas. So I suspect that's what would have happened initially. Assuming, of course, that even if the Third Battle of Panipat had taken place, that Ahmad Shah Abdali would have gone back and the Marathas would have then reasserted themselves, because Ahmad Shah Abdali had no interest in ruling India. He just wanted to loot, and he looted and he went, whereas the British looted and stayed for a couple of 100 years. So that was another difference. And then, you can look at what happened in Japan and Thailand, where I think what would have happened is that we would have evolved into a sort of constitutional monarchy. The Mughals were a very convenient symbol to keep, but they would have been powerless because the real power would have been with the Peshwas. And gradually, with the advent of technology, with the purchase of the technologies coming in from the West, as happened in Japan after the Meiji Restoration, as happened in Thailand, these are the two non-colonized Asian countries we can see. What would have happened is that eventually, we would have gradually moved to a stage where internal calls for democracy, strengthened by railway communication, everything else, would have gradually given us, it seems to me, a move towards the kind of freedoms we've seen elsewhere. In between, we would have probably had a rather militarized India because the Marathas were essentially warriors. You would have had a kind of shogunate, as the Japanese had it, sort of military ruler under a nominal king. The king would have had very little power. These guys have been calling the shots. But think of the advantages. We would have had no communal divisions in this country because they would be all paying allegiance to a Muslim monarch, the Mughal emperor, while being ruled by Hindu warriors, the Marathas. And I think there would have been much more seamless integration of the communities, undoubtedly. We wouldn't have had the traumas of partition and the waste of defense expenditure that happened thereafter. And inevitably, because Indians are Indians, we would have found ourselves throwing up reform movements, liberal democracy movements, etc., sooner or later. And I think change would have come through that process. Inevitably, as happened pretty much everywhere else that went through comparable histories. So that's my guess. You know, an India that would have been united, that would have been non-communalized, that would have been coexisting in peace, and would have been pretty powerful and rich because it was all that to begin with. And the progress that the British denied us, we could have essentially purchased. If we were the biggest textile exporters in the world, and somebody invents a cotton mill in England, buy the darn thing, you know, install it in India, replicate it here. If railways are being manufactured for the first time in England, and they could be imported to countries that didn't have to go through the trouble and expense of being colonized to get the railways, we could have done the same thing. So I don't agree that we needed colonization to be anything that we are today. We would have found our own way. But as it happens, history didn't allow us to.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure the audience now has a lot of content to question and cross-question. So we'll open the house for Q&A. You can raise your hands and I'll... okay. Do we have a mic?